The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway flickered as Bryson Newman sat in the wheelchair, his father's hand resting on his shoulder, waiting for what felt like the final goodbye. Outside, San Diego's spring air carried the scent of eucalyptus and ocean salt. But inside these sterile walls, time moved differently, measured in pill bottles and scan results. In moments of terror, masked by teenage bravado, the doctors had used words like experimental and Florida and last resort. Words that landed like stones in still water, rippling outward into everything his family had once thought certain. His mother's eyes carried shadows deeper than sleepless nights. And his father, the man who'd slept on hospital floors for months, who'd screamed at God in empty stairwells, now wore a smile so fragile it might shatter with a breath. They were wheeling him back to Cathedral Catholic High School, not for classes or baseball practice, but for what everyone understood without saying, a chance for his classmates to say the words they might never get to speak again. The tumor in his brain had returned with a vengeance, growing like wildfire despite every weapon modern medicine could throw at it. And now, the family was down to their final option, a clinical trial thousands of miles away that might buy him weeks, maybe months, but probably not years. 15 months earlier, Bryson had been unstoppable, a sophomore who played baseball like he was born with a glove in his hand, catching, shortstop, second base, whatever position his team needed. He filled it with the kind of natural grace that made college scouts take notice. He'd just finished a strong season and was packing his bags for Japan, ready to compete with his San Diego Show baseball team, when the headaches started subtle at first, easy to blame on dehydration or stress or the bright California sun beating down during practice. Then came the day in the batter's box when pain crushed his skull with such intensity that his helmet felt like it was caving in, and later, the nosebleed that wouldn't stop, the kind that sends mothers reaching for car keys and fathers forgetting to lock the front door. The emergency room doctor, young and tired, had dismissed his symptoms with the casual confidence of someone who'd seen too many athletes with minor concussions. But Bryson's parents pushed for tests. When the MRI images appeared on the screen, everyone in that room stopped breathing. A mass the size of a ping-pong ball, sitting where it had no right to be, in the very center of a 16-year-old's brain. The doctors explained, one of the most aggressive forms of brain cancer known to medicine, the kind that grows fast and spreads faster, the kind that gives young people survival rates written in single digits. Within 6 hours of that diagnosis, Bryson was in surgery, a 12-hour procedure that left his family pacing hospital corridors, praying into clasped hands, calling everyone they knew to pray with them. When he woke, groggy and confused, his first words were about baseball. "Sew me up. I have a plane to catch. I've got to get back on the team with my teammates." But there would be no plane to Japan, no return to the diamond for Bryson Newman. Not that season, and maybe not ever. The tumor had been removed, or so they thought. But 3 weeks later, a staph infection nearly killed him, and when the infection finally cleared, the scans showed what no parent should ever have to see: the tumor had grown back completely during those lost weeks, filling the space the surgeon had carved out with such precision. Another 12-hour surgery followed, leaving Bryson partially paralyzed, his right eye permanently turned to the side, his balance so compromised that he needed a wheelchair to move more than a few feet. The boy who'd run bases with the speed of wind now struggled to walk in a straight line, and the light in his eyes, that spark that had made him the heart of every team he'd ever played on, dimmed under the weight of what was being asked of him. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Chemotherapy came next, poison pumped into veins to kill cells growing too fast, cells that belonged to him but wanted him dead. Then radiation, beams of energy focused on the tumor bed, trying to burn out whatever invisible seeds of cancer might remain. His father slept on the hospital floor every night, refusing to leave, refusing to let his son fight this battle alone. And when the exhaustion and fear became too much, Rick Newman would slip into the stairwell where no one could hear him and screaming at God, cursing the unfairness of it all, demanding to know why his son, Why this bright and beautiful boy who'd never hurt anyone had to endure this medieval torture. But the prayers continued to, whispered and shouted, formal and desperate. From family and friends and strangers who'd heard the story of the Cathedral Catholic sophomore fighting for his life, months passed, like years, measured in blood draws and scan appointments. In good days, when Bryson could smile and joke with his friends from the hospital bed, and bad days when the pain swallowed every hour whole, the treatments left him weak, his hair gone, his body a shadow of the athlete he'd been. But somehow, through sheer will, or grace, or some mysterious combination of both, he kept showing up. He came to baseball games in his wheelchair, keeping stats for his teammates, refusing to let cancer take everything from him. He went to school when he could, sat with friends at lunch, held his girlfriend's hand in the hallways, lived as much of his normal teenage life as the disease would allow. But normal was slipping away. In the spring of 2016, nearly a year after his diagnosis, the enhancement in the tumor bed began growing again, a bright spot on the MRI that meant the cancer was winning. That all the surgeries and chemicals and radiation hadn't been enough. His doctors, some of the best in San Diego, sat down with the Newman family and used the words, "Every cancer family dreads. We've tried everything standard. Your only option now is experimental." They'd been accepted to a clinical trial in Florida, the same immunotherapy that had saved former President Jimmy Carter's life just months before, a treatment that offered hope but no promises. The family began packing, preparing for a 2-month stay across the country that would mean Bryson missing his senior year milestones, missing graduation with his class, missing everything that made high school matter. It felt like exile, like being sent away to die far from home, even though no one said those words out loud. Then, and Major, someone from Cathedral Catholic, called with a simple request. Would Bryson like to come to school to say goodbye to a few friends before leaving for Florida? It seemed like a small thing, a kind gesture to ease the transition. And so, on an April afternoon, the Newmans drove to Cathedral Catholic one more time. Rick wheeled his son down toward Manchester Stadium, the football field where the Dons played their home games, expecting to find a handful of close friends waiting with cards and hugs and awkward teenage attempts at comfort. What they found instead stopped time. The bleachers of Manchester Stadium were filled not with a dozen friends, but with the entire school, all 1,600 to 1,800 students, faculty, and staff, wearing red in solidarity while Bryson sat alone in the center in white. The California sun poured down on the scene like liquid gold, illuminating faces streaked with tears. Hands raised toward heaven, voices beginning to rise in prayer. No one had told the Newmans this was happening. It was meant to be a surprise, an outpouring of love so complete that it left the family speechless. Bryson, frail and wheelchair-bound, looked up at the sea of his classmates, teammates, and lab partners, friends and acquaintances, people he'd never spoken to but who knew his name, who'd been praying for him in their own homes and churches for months, and felt something break open in his chest. The prayer began softly, then swelled like a wave. Hundreds of young voices asking God for the impossible, pleading for mercy, for healing, for one more chance. Students stretched their hands toward Bryson, a gesture of blessing older than Christianity itself. And the air seemed to thicken with something beyond words' presence, weight. The sense that whatever happened in the next moment mattered in ways none of them could fully understand. For Bryson, the sensation was physical, warmth spreading through his body, like taking clothes fresh from the dryer and wrapping himself in their clean, sun-warmed softness, a feeling of being held, being loved, being somehow impossibly made whole in that moment. Surrounded by 1,600 voices lifted in one prayer, Bryson Newman felt God move, not in metaphor or memory, but in his bones, in the marrow where cancer had taken root, in the space behind his eyes where tumors had grown and been cut away and grown back again. The warmth continued, steady and gentle, not painful or frightening, but deeply, almost unbearably peaceful, as if every cell in his body was being touched by invisible hands. His father stood beside him, watching his son's face transform from resignation to wonder, seeing something he couldn't name but recognized as holy. The prayer lasted perhaps 20 minutes, though time had become meaningless. It might have been 20 seconds or 20 hours, measured not in clock ticks but in breaths taken and released, in tears shed and dried, in the collective weight of faith pressing against the walls of what anyone thought possible. When it ended, the stadium was silent, except for the wind moving through eucalyptus trees beyond the fence, carrying the scent of spring and salt, and something else, something like hope, reborn. Bryson looked up at his classmates, many of them weeping openly now, and tried to find words for what had happened, but language felt too small, too clumsy for the territory they'd just crossed together. "Thank you" seemed inadequate. "I felt God heal me" seemed too bold, too presumptuous, even though that was exactly what his heart was screaming. So he simply nodded, tears streaming down his face, and let his father wheel him back to the car, carrying the warmth of that prayer like a secret, too precious to speak aloud. Days later, the Newman family boarded their flight to Florida, still expecting to begin the experimental treatment, still bracing for 2 months of clinical trials and hotel rooms and uncertainty. Before starting the therapy, protocol required new scans to establish a baseline, fresh MRI images to measure exactly how much tumor remained, where it sat, how aggressive it appeared. Bryson lay still in the machine while it hummed and clicked, taking pictures of his brain in thin slices, mapping the landscape of his disease with merciless precision. The radiologist in Florida reviewed the images, then called for a second opinion, then a third, because what the scans showed made no medical sense. Where the enhancement had been growing, where active cancer had lit up the previous MRI like a beacon, there was now nothing. Not smaller, not stable, not responding to treatment, gone, vanished, erased as if it had never existed. The Florida doctors sent the images back to San Diego, asking if perhaps there'd been a mix-up, if maybe these were someone else's scans, because the tumor that had sent this family across the country no longer appeared to exist. The San Diego oncologists confirmed the patient identity, checked and rechecked their records, and reached the same impossible conclusion. Bryson Newman's brain cancer had disappeared. No trace remained of the enhancement that had been growing just weeks before. No shadow or scar tissue or suspicious density, only healthy brain matter, where death had been building its stronghold. The word miracle was spoken first by the doctors, not the family, those trained in science and evidence, who'd spent years learning to measure hope in percentages and survival curves, found themselves using language from another realm altogether. "We can't explain it," they told the Newmans. "We've never seen anything like this. It's a miracle." Rick Newman, who'd lost his faith, screaming in hospital stairwells, felt it return like a flood, like being knocked down by a wave he hadn't seen coming. His guilt at having doubted God was immediate and crushing, but mixed with a joy so profound that he could barely speak. All he could do was hold his son and weep and thank everyone, the doctors, the nurses, God, the students at Cathedral Catholic who'd prayed in Manchester Stadium. Bryson himself felt stunned, trying to reconcile what he'd experienced during that prayer with what the scans now confirmed, understanding on some level that the two were connected but unable to fully grasp the mechanics of grace. The Florida doctors, no longer needed for experimental treatment, sent the family home with follow-up instructions and barely concealed amazement. On the flight back to San Diego, Bryson stared out the window at clouds and coastline, touching his head where tumors had grown, where surgeons had cut and chemicals had burned, where prayer had somehow accomplished what medicine could not. He thought about the stadium full of his classmates, their hands raised toward him, their voices asking God for the impossible, and he understood with perfect clarity that he'd been given not just his life back, but a purpose, a calling to pass forward what had been given to him. The news spread through Cathedral Catholic like wildfire, then through San Diego, then across the country as media outlets picked up the story of the teenage cancer patient whose tumor vanished after a massive prayer gathering. Students who'd been in the stadium that April day felt their faith shift from abstract concept to lived reality. Many would later say that praying over Bryson changed their understanding of God more than years of religion classes. Parents called the Newman home to tell them their own children had started praying more seriously, taking faith more personally, after witnessing what happened at Manchester. Doctors who treated Bryson, trained to remain professionally skeptical, found themselves unable to offer purely medical explanations, acknowledging in quiet conversations that sometimes rarely, but sometimes things happen that science cannot account for. Bryson returned to Cathedral Catholic, not as a patient or a victim, but as a living testament, bold from treatment but cancer-free. Able to graduate with his class, able to attend prom and senior week and all the ordinary, extraordinary moments of teenage life that had once seemed impossibly far away. His friends surrounded him with fierce protectiveness and joy, understanding they'd witnessed something rare and sacred, something that would mark them for the rest of their lives. Trevor Hoffman, the legendary Padres closer, whose sons Quinn and Wyatt had become like family to Bryson during his illness, arranged for Bryson to attend the 2016 All-Star Game in a restored 1966 Cobalt Blue Mustang, a car that had been rusted and broken when Ed Hansen began fixing it, working on the vehicle's cancer while Bryson fought his own, both projects declared impossible, but somehow completed anyway. In the years following his healing, Bryson Newman could have simply moved on, returning to normal life and leaving cancer in his rearview mirror. Many survivors do exactly that, and no one would have blamed him. But the hours he'd spent in hospital rooms, watching young children fight battles they didn't understand, seeing families torn apart by disease that showed no mercy to innocence, those memories wouldn't release him. He remembered being one of the older patients on the pediatric oncology floor, noticing how the hospital television channels were designed for much younger kids, how the hours crawled by in sterile isolation while treatments stripped away not just cancer but childhood itself. So Bryson founded the Miracle at Manchester Foundation, naming it after the prayer that had saved his life, dedicating it to helping other pediatric cancer patients stay connected to their families, friends, and schools during long hospital stays. The Foundation's primary mission is simple but profound: provide iPads to hospitalized children, preloaded with educational software, entertainment, and video calling apps that let them see their classrooms and friends, even from isolation rooms. Each iPad costs $450, and Bryson works tirelessly to raise funds and deliver them personally to children's hospitals. Looking into the eyes of kids who remind him of himself at 15, scared, hurting, wondering if they'll ever feel normal again. "I'm not going to be the one to cure cancer," he told interviewers with characteristic humility. "But I can help fight the boredom and isolation that you have while in the hospital." His parents accompany him on hospital visits, watching their son, who they almost lost, who was given a 5% chance of survival, now bringing light into the darkest rooms, connecting with children who understand what he's been through because he bears the scars to prove it. Rick Newman, who once lost his faith so completely that he raged at God in empty stairwells, now speaks publicly about the journey, about how his son's healing rebuilt not just a body but an entire family's trust and grace. Bryson went on to graduate from UC Santa Barbara with a degree in communications and a minor in sports management, then pursued his master's at Texas A&M, building a career in sports public relations while continuing his foundation work. The Miracle at Manchester Foundation has since delivered over 150 iPads to 3 different children's hospitals, with plans to eventually reach every pediatric oncology ward in the nation. And in 2023, Hollywood Came Calling JCFILMs produced a feature film titled Miracle at Manchester, starring Eddie McGlintock as Rick Newman and Dean Cain in a supporting role, telling Bryson's story to audiences who might never have heard about the teenager from San Diego and the stadium full of students who asked God for a miracle. McGlintock, who also directed the film, spent 2 weeks being picked up for work each morning by Rick Newman, absorbing the family's energy and faith, trying to capture on screen what can only partially be conveyed through cinema, the moment when heaven touches earth, when the impossible becomes simply what is. But beyond the foundation work, and the film, and the speaking engagements, What remains most powerful about Bryson Newman's story is its irreducible simplicity. A boy was dying, a community prayed, and he lived. The medical records document the tumor's presence and its disappearance. The photographs capture 1,600 students with hands raised in Manchester Stadium. The subsequent years prove that whatever happened that April afternoon in 2016 was real and lasting. Doctors may use the word remission out of professional caution, but they also use the word miracle in private conversations, acknowledging what the scans cannot explain. For the students of Cathedral Catholic who were there that day, the memory remains sharp as broken glass, the weight of that moment, the sense of participating in something beyond themselves. The knowledge that prayer can move mountains when those mountains are tumors, and the prayer is offered by 1,600 young people who refuse to accept that their friend must die. For Rick and Nicole Newman, every day with their son is a gift they know they might not have received. A mercy they don't claim to deserve, but accept with profound gratitude. And for Bryson himself, the warm sensation he felt during that prayer, like clean clothes from a dryer, like being held by invisible hands, remains the most real thing he's ever experienced. The touchstone he returns to when life gets hard, or when he sits beside another sick child, trying to find hope in a hospital room. Faith, the saying goes, is believing what you cannot see. But sometimes, faith becomes seeing what you already believe, recognizing the hand of God in the places where medicine ends and mystery begins. In the space between diagnosis and healing, between despair and joy, Bryson Newman's story doesn't answer all questions about why some prayers seem answered and others met with silence, why some children walk out of hospitals cured while others never leave. These are the ancient questions, the ones that have troubled believers since Job sat in ashes demanding explanations from heaven. What Bryson's story does offer is testimony that on one April afternoon in San Diego, California, in a high school stadium named Manchester, something happened that doctors cannot fully explain, that 1,600 witnesses will never forget, and that changed the trajectory of one family's nightmare into a tale of hope told across the nation. It reminds us that we are not alone in our darkest hours. That community matters. That prayer, whether whispered in solitude or shouted by thousands, has power we may not understand but cannot deny. It calls us to show up for one another, the way Cathedral Catholic showed up for Bryson. To believe in possibilities beyond diagnosis and prognosis, to raise our hands toward heaven even when heaven seems impossibly far away, because sometimes the miracle we're asking for is already on its way. Carried on the voices of friends we didn't know were praying, held in the hands of a God who sees what doctors cannot, who heals in ways that leave even skeptics speaking the language of wonder. This account draws from verified events documented by the Catholic News Agency, the National Catholic Register, NBC San Diego, CBS, Ocho, and Pure Flix in reports published between 2016 and 2023. The story of Bryson Newman's diagnosis with medulloblastoma in 2015, the prayer gathering at Manchester Stadium in April 2016, involving approximately 1,600 Cathedral Catholic students, the subsequent disappearance of his tumor, confirmed by medical scans, and his founding of the Miracle at Manchester Foundation has been covered extensively by multiple independent news outlets and medical professionals. The 2023 feature film Miracle at Manchester, starring Eddie McGlintock and Dean Cain, was produced by JC Films and based on these documented events. Bryson Newman continues his foundation work today, bringing hope to pediatric cancer patients while bearing witness to what happened when an entire school community refused to accept that medicine had spoken the final word.